Good afternoon. We have a couple of questions to run through. The first is from Malaysia. Thank you and sadhu to Lumpur for your Dhamma teaching. My question is there any difference in merit if we observe the 8 precepts at home compared to observing in the temple? Well, you have to observe what goes on in your practice when you're at home and then when you're at the temple. The heart of sila, or keeping precepts, is training the intention, cetana, to refrain from killing, refrain from stealing, refrain from sexual misconduct, or if you're keeping the 8 precepts, refrain from all sexual activity, refrain from lying, abusive, divisive speech, refrain from taking intoxicants, refrain from eating after noon, refrain from wearing adornments, and perfumes, and indulging in entertainments and music, and to refrain from sleeping on a high and luxurious bed. You're training in that intention to bring it up and maintain it through your effort and your mindfulness and your determination. Understanding that these precepts will help your practice of abandoning attachment to sensuality, to various unwholesome, harmful ways of behavior. The 8 precepts we call nekama precepts. So if you study the Noble Eightfold Path, the second factor is samma sankappa, right intention or right thought. So it's particularly characterized by, say, abstinence from all sexual behavior, which is going to reduce the amount of sensuality in your life as long as you're keeping the 8 precepts drastically. But also it's, say, reducing your the distractions, music, entertainment, shows, not dressing up, so perfumes, makeup, all these things. Sleeping on a simple bed and sleeping alone. So the whole purpose of the 8 precepts is to bring simplicity to your life and a renunciation of various aspects of sensuality that we may normally be engaged with. So very suitable for a monastery, but more challenging at home. So like you've pointed out, it's possible maybe that keeping 8 precepts at home, because there's more temptation, more distraction, it may be harder. And that's why you get less people doing it at home. You have to help yourself if you're at home by maybe, one, by telling everyone else you're doing it, so they understand why you're behaving maybe differently than normal. Setting up your home to support the precepts, so having your own room to sleep in and meditate in would be ideal, or even a separate part of the home or granny flat or something where you can go separate from the rest of the family for the period you're keeping 8 precepts, unless you live alone or you're in a very quiet house perhaps. People who keep the 8 precepts regularly can build up that experience where they're just used to them and they don't feel tempted by, say, the desire to eat in the evening, or to seek out a sexual partner, or indulge in shows and that, they get used to not doing those things. So then they may be able to keep the 8 precepts just as well as when they're in the monastery. That usually comes through experience, doing it often, and still they'll tend to adapt their lifestyle to support keeping of the 8 precepts, because they're living a more meditative lifestyle. It's not that one even can keep the 8 precepts perfectly in a monastery, maybe, or a temple. Sometimes people break the precepts in a temple. So the bottom line is that determination and intention to refrain from those kind of activities that are not within the precepts. So one needs restraint, patience when one's own desires come up. You may be angry and want to blurt out something, you may want to tell a lie, you may want to eat in the evening, and so on. You need the determination, the patience with your own different moods and desires that come up. You need some wisdom to understand how to keep the precepts successfully, remind yourself why you're doing it, and know the dangers, so you stay away from situations that may tempt you to break them. You need a whole range of qualities. You need the kindness and compassion, say, with part of the aspects of precepts is not harming others, including animals, so not killing bugs and not taking your anger out on people or animals around you. So you need to cultivate the opposite qualities than those that would lead you to break the precepts. So cultivate kindness, compassion, cultivate mindfulness, sobriety, honesty, love of truth, and so on, to keep the precepts. And if you're cultivating those qualities, well, whether you're at home or in the temple, the ideal, the aim is to have your 8 precepts established, so wherever you go, you're using them as tools, as ways to train yourself. And it doesn't change wherever you are. But we have to be practical and accept that in some situations it's very challenging to keep the 8 precepts. So, that's why we have monasteries, temples, places, Buddhist centers, places of retreat. It's to help with the practice. Those places are set up for people keeping precepts, meditating. So usually the environment, the place will support that, whereas home is more of a free-for-all, and certainly there'll be more sensuality, more distraction, more confusing behavior of other people maybe, or more antisocial behavior, or just behavior that's of a different standard than someone who's keeping the 8 precepts. So that's the challenge. And if it's too difficult at home, well then you have to look for those opportunities to go and stay on retreat, or in a monastery or Buddhist center or somewhere. So in the end you have to ask yourself, how well is your practice going at home? And if it's very hard to keep the 8 precepts, well, there's nothing wrong with keeping the 5 precepts. Try to do that. That's the basic minimum for a Buddhist practitioner. That's your aim every day, is to try to follow the 5 precepts. If you break 1 or 2, well, try to re-establish your undertaking, the training to follow them again. So you start again, basically. You don't need a teacher or a monk to start again. You just make your own determination in your mind. Oh, today I blew it. I told a lie. I said something I shouldn't, or did something that was not very good. I regret that. Once you become mindful of it, then you re-establish your intention to keep the precepts. And the idea is, if you keep them long enough, it becomes second nature. So you don't even think of killing, stealing, committing acts of sexual misconduct or having any sexual activity if you're following the 8 precepts. It just becomes second nature. So you're no longer struggling. Maybe in the beginning you struggle, but later on you can relax because you know the precepts and you quite naturally are following them. You appreciate how they help your practice, so there's much less of a struggle or feeling you're forcing yourself to keep them. You actually want to keep them, and maybe you reach a point where you really don't want to break precepts or go back to the 5 precepts, even if you've been keeping 8 precepts, or you may go on to become a monk or a nun. You may get to the point where you just have no wish, no intention to return to former modes of behavior, and that would be really good. So you just basically, you almost like you forget how to break the precepts. You just don't think in that way anymore. Then your mind is free of a lot of mental defilements, the coarser ones, and that allows your mind to go deeper in meditation. So the 8 precepts are really there to help train your mind in abandoning greed, anger and delusion on the coarsest level, so that you can attain states of samadhi, develop continuous mindfulness, insight into impermanence, not self. And 8 precepts can, you could attain all the way to what we call anagami, non-returner. Becoming arahant, you probably would become a monk or a nun, usually speaking. But there have been, throughout Buddhist history, some lay practitioners keeping 8 precepts who've attained anagami. And that's a very commendable thing. And the precepts are a vessel or a vehicle that will get you there if you use them well. So I wish you well in your practice, and just reflect on how to do it when you're at home, to see if you can keep the precepts just as well as when you're in a monastery. If you are a monk or a nun, then you usually think twice about going home for long periods because of the challenges of keeping your discipline, your precepts at home. So if other people don't keep them, then you constantly run into situations where your precepts are challenged, or people maybe even criticize you, or they just don't understand what you're doing and why. They don't see the benefit of it, so they don't support you. The obvious one is you as a monk, Buddhist monk, you might go home to visit family, and they always eat in the evening, and you're sitting there with them and they're eating in front of you. So if you've been a monk a long time, you probably don't give it a second thought. You just know they're just doing what they normally do. But if you're a brand new monk, it might be tempting. And you may even have a mischievous relative who sort of has their plate of food and says, "Do you want any?" And you have to deal with your own desires, being tempted. But what you find is, over time, if you practice more, then you just get used to the differences in people's behavior, and you don't think much of it. You have kindness, compassion, understanding. It's not usually a problem. That was the last question online. There was another question today in the monastery, which was, Ajahn, where do the kilesas come from? So kilesa means mental defilement, those mental states that defile the mind. And you probably hear quite often that we're practicing to know and abandon the kilesas. So kilesas are those mental states rooted in greed, anger, delusion, and all their offshoots, so like jealousy and anxiety and fear and envy, stubbornness and laziness, and conceit and arrogance. There's what you might call the more subtle manifestations of kilesa. But one thing they all have in common is these mental states, they all defile the mind, meaning they blemish the mind, they take away some of the natural radiance of the mind, they darken the mind. So if you have strong kilesa or lots of kilesas coming up, the mind feels and appears very dark. If defilements are fading away, the mind brightens. And the Buddhist teachings are based on this understanding that even though our minds are defiled, defilements are visitors to the mind. They come and go according to causes and conditions. So you're not always angry, always greedy, always caught into confusion or worry. These states of mind will come and go according to the situation, which means there's a chance to abandon defilements if we develop the right qualities, the skills of the Noble Eightfold Path, particularly Sila, Samadhi, Panya, mindfulness and wisdom. Defilements could be seen and abandoned. And the Buddha abandoned all of them. They no longer came into his mind or came up into his mind. That's what we call Nibbana, a state when you're free from defilement. And that's because that's possible for humans to do, then the Buddha taught this whole path. So it's an important point that defilements are not you are not your defilements. They are visitors to the mind, and they cause great destruction and suffering and trouble for each individual and between individuals and people, but they aren't really you. They're not self. They're impermanent, they're not self, so they can be abandoned. Where do kilesas come from? Well, they come from other kilesas, previously arising kilesas, meaning one kilesa will condition and support another kilesa, and on and on and on and on. So it's almost like there's no beginning to the whole thing. When kilesas come into the mind and we're not mindful and we're not insightful in that moment, we don't see them as impermanent, as not self, we tend to react to kilesa. We indulge them, we attach to them, we become them. We become kilesa, as it were. We identify with them, greed, anger, delusion. So that reinforces them, makes them come up again, maybe even stronger next time round, and more often maybe. So kilesas feed more kilesas, which is why we have to practice, because otherwise our mind becomes like free rein. Sometimes, Ajahn Chah would say kilesas are like a tyrant or a bully, and they come into the mind and they make us do all these horrible things. They make us unhappy, they make us depressed, annoyed, not peaceful, they disturb us. So they're like as if you've got somebody there in your mind always causing you trouble, making you want things when you might have been happily content, but then you want something else, so you're not happy again. Make you angry, make you get caught into wrong views, wrong thinking all the time. So they push us around and make trouble for us. That's why we have to learn to recognize them and abandon them through the practice. But as long as we don't practice, the kilesas run around, they invade the mind, they take over the mind, and then they feed more kilesa. But as we start to practice, kilesa are revealed, exposed for what they are, the cause of suffering. So then we get the wisdom that says, oh, this is to be let go of, abandoned. Rather than hold on to what makes me suffer, let it go. And your mind becomes a little more peaceful, clearer, brighter, happier. And then that only helps you to see kilesas all the more. So most practitioners have this experience. You practice cultivating mindfulness, insight, recognizing kilesa as kilesa, going beyond them. You're practicing sila, you're going beyond kilesa that would lead you to break sila, break precepts. Developing samadhi, you're letting go of the 5 hindrances. Developing wisdom and insight, you're undermining and uprooting kilesa at the very source, removing the ignorance, the lack of awareness that causes kilesa. So as you practice, kilesas are exposed and revealed and abandoned more and more, which allows you to see ever more refined forms of kilesa. So it's a bit like cleaning your, say you have a glass, a drinking glass, and you clean it once, you wipe it down, you wash it, wash away all the grease and the finger marks and the dust from it. And you might think, my glass is clean. And on one level it's very clean now that you've washed it. But if you hold it up to the sunlight, maybe you notice there's still just a few specks of dust or a few fingerprints or something that you missed before. So holding it up to the light of the sun, you see those marks and you give it a second clean. And then you may think, well, that's it. Even in the sunlight, I can't see any blemish, any dust, any dirt. That's it. It's perfectly clean. And then maybe a scientist comes along with all his equipment, and under the microscope he sees, well, actually it's full of bacteria and stuff that you missed. And, oh, okay, we better try harder. So you go back and maybe use certain chemical products and other techniques to really get down to the surface of this glass and get every last bit of dirt, bacteria, grime, everything off it. And the mind is a bit like that. You clear away one level of kilesa, say by keeping precepts, you clear away the coarsest anger that makes you insult others and fight others and hurt others. Then you'll have some more subtle anger and irritation left in your mind. Or you clear away the coarsest kind of greed that would lead you to steal or cheat on your partner or go out and get drunk and do all kinds of crazy things. You abandon all that, but then you'll still have subtle greed and attachment in your mind. Maybe you're subtly attached to pleasant mind states and all kinds of ideas and feelings that arise internally. So as you meditate, you're forever going deeper into your consciousness, exposing more subtle, more refined defilements, which can be a bit daunting at first, because it's like, oh, you just work with all these coarse defilements and then you find you've got a whole range of subtle defilements you didn't even know about. And you have the feeling like, when will it ever end? But don't give up, because the Buddha and Ajahn Chah and all the teachers remind us that it can end through the practice. And you just keep working on cleaning up your mind, picking out the dirt, the negativity, the craving, the attachment, and eventually there'll be nothing left. But you have to keep going, keep practicing. So there's some teaching on defilements and precepts. I'll leave it there for this afternoon session, and we've got a bit of time left, so we can meditate quietly together until we hear the sound of the bell.